Napoleon decided on a countercoup by assaulting the Russian left as Bennigsen moved west. To lure the Russians into the trap, he ordered French forces in the north to pull back, hoping ultimately to scythe through the Russian center and bisect their army. This promising plan miscarried when one of the French couriers got lost and delivered a copy of the Emperor's battle plans to the Russians. This mishap ruined Napoleon's entire winter strategy, for Bennigsen now realized to his horror the thin ice on which he had been skating and halted operations for a rethink. The Russian pause made Napoleon confused about their actions, and it was the 3rd of February before he realized the enemy must be aware of his intentions. His problem was that although 80,000 new troops had been levied, he barely had enough in hand for his immediate purposes. With insufficient forces, he pressed forward and engaged the Russians at Lonkovo, but the battle was indecisive as night fell before the French columns could get into position. The warning signs were already there. The terrain in eastern Prussia did not suit the style of the Grand Army, so that the rapid war of maneuver was not practicable. Cold, rain, snow, quicksands, inadequate supplies and guerrilla attacks by Prussian partisans all worked against Napoleon, and his supply situation was even further jeopardized by the scorched earth policy adopted by Bennigsen as he retreated. However, when Augereau's corps and the Guard arrived on the 4th of February, Napoleon was confident he would be able to beat the Russians next day. Once again, though, before he could complete his encirclement, Bennigsen retreated and again escaped the trap. Again it was the darkness that had thwarted the emperor, for nightfall, occurring so early at this time of the year in these latitudes, came down just before he had got all units into position, so that by a hair's breadth he was robbed of the decisive victory he sought. He urged on his marshals to harry and pursue the fleeing Russians, and it was nips and stings from these gadflies that finally made Bennigsen turn around and face his tormentors on the 6th of February 1807. Napoleon thought to surprise the Russians, but it was they who surprised him, and in an inferior position. The dreadful Battle of Eylau began as an outpost skirmish. It was not fought in circumstances of Napoleon's choosing, for, outnumbered as he was and outpointed in the artillery sphere, he wanted to wait until all his forces came up before giving battle. But the initial skirmish soon escalated into all-out, sanguinary conflict. Starting at 2 p.m. on the 7th of February, the battle raged on until 10 p.m., with artillery flashes lighting up the night sky. Each side sustained about 4,000 casualties, but there was little chance of survival for the wounded on a night when temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. After spending a frightful night in the open, troops on both sides greeted the dawn, to find almost continual snowstorms driving into their faces. Squinting and blinking into the white hell, 75,000 Frenchmen prepared to do battle with roughly the same number of Russians. Bennigsen still had a marked superiority in artillery. Ever dreaming of a second Cannae, Napoleon ordered Soult to attempt the pinning operation while Devout and Ney tried to work round the flanks. Augereau and Murat would be held for the decisive attack, with the Guard in reserve. The Russians opened fire at 8 a.m. and soon a full-scale artillery duel was raging. At 8:30 Napoleon ordered Soult to attack the Russian right, to divert attention from the left where the decisive stroke would be delivered. But the Russians got their assault in first. Marching across the frozen lakes and marshes from about 9 a.m. on, they drove Soult rapidly back to Eylau, where a desperate struggle commenced. Even more menacingly, the Russians then started making inroads on the French left. Napoleon had neither anticipated this assault nor the speed with which Soult was driven back. He had no option but to order forward the reserve under Augereau with General Saint-Hilaire to contain the Russian left. This was risky and premature, for Devout was not yet on the scene. But Napoleon hoped he could stabilize the battle situation until he had his trump cards ready. Proceeding in a heavy blizzard, Augereau's corps advanced deployed instead of in column. In the blinding snowstorm they quickly lost sight of their targets and blundered straight into the path of the Russian 7-0 gun battery, where they were cut to pieces at point-blank range. Saint-Hilaire's division did manage to reach its target, but without their intended comrades, and Augereau's corps could not effect a breakthrough. By 10:30 a.m. the battle appeared lost, with Soult driven back, Augereau's corps annihilated and Saint-Hilaire's division halted. An ominous gap appeared in the center of the French line, and Bennigsen clearly held all the cards. Even while the remains of Augereau's corps were being slaughtered, some 6,000 Russians penetrated the town of Eylau. Napoleon, who had been using the bell tower as his vantage point, would certainly have been killed or captured but for the heroism of his personal escort, who held the line until 2 battalions of guards came up. Napoleon could sense the extreme gravity of the situation, so ordered the second half of the reserve, originally designed to spearhead the final breakthrough, into the breach. At about 11:30 a.m. there occurred the most famous cavalry charge in history as Murat's horsemen hurled themselves upon the Russian center. They smashed through and seized the guns that had annihilated Augereau's corps. For the loss of R. Sumen Murat saved the day for France, relieving Augereau, Soult and Saint-Hilaire at a stroke. Bennigsen, who thought himself on the brink of victory, became confused and felt he had underestimated the strength of the French center. He hesitated and thus by midday had lost his chance of victory. The obvious next ploy was for Napoleon to order the guard into the center to widen the gap made by Murat. Once again he manifested his extraordinary reluctance to use the guard. The excuse he afterwards gave was that he was afraid a Prussian division under General Lestock might appear on the field. He therefore ordered all his units, Murat's as well as Soult's and the remnants of Augereau's, to dig in and hold until Devout completed his encirclement. By RPM, Devout was ready. He and Saint-Hilaire now pushed back the Russian southern flank until it resembled a hairpin. But just when victory was almost theirs, what Napoleon most feared came to pass. Lestock arrived on the field at 3:20 p.m., having evaded Ney. The marshal later exculpated himself by saying he could hear nothing, neither guns nor the tramp of marching men, because of the howling din of the wind and falling snow. By 4 p.m. Lestock was easing the pressure on the Russians by falling on Devout's open flank. Step by step Devout's heroes were forced to relinquish the ground they had taken so painfully. Sensing that the pendulum in this seesaw battle was now swinging back to the Russians, Napoleon pinned all his hopes on Ney, for only he could turn the tide. Fortunately for him, Ney arrived on the Russian right around 7 p.m. and threw Rs. 0 fresh troops into the fray. By Rho p.m., the fortified French had fought the Russians to a standstill. In essence, the emperor's nerve held better than Bennigsen's. At a council of war, Bennigsen overruled his generals who wanted to extend the fighting into a third day, and at midnight began abandoning the field, screened by Cossacks. The exhausted French were in no position to follow. After 14 hours, tens of thousands of corpses littered the field, where the deep whiteness of the snow was stained, streaked and striated with blood. The French had taken casualties of 1 in 3 and had lost 25,000 men. The Russians lost 5,000. Napoleon was forced to crank his propaganda machine into top gear to disguise the scale of the disaster, using the dubious fact that he had been left in possession of the field to claim victory. About the scale of the casualties he lied barefacedly, admitting to only 900 dead and 5,700 wounded. Secretly glad the Russians had not decided to renew the conflict next day, he looked around for scapegoats. He found more than he was looking for, as, incredibly, Bernadotte had once again disobeyed orders. The emperor had sent General Hautpal to the Gascon marshal with urgent orders to bring his corps to Eylau. Bernadotte claimed never to have received any such order, and as Hautpal was killed in the battle, there was no way to nail Bernadotte's transparent lie. Next day Napoleon rode over the battlefield, gloomily inspecting the mounds of corpses. Later he wrote to Josephine, "The countryside is covered with dead and wounded. This is not the pleasantest part of war. One suffers and the soul is oppressed to see so many sufferers." That was an understatement. Percy, surgeon to the Grand Army, put it more vividly: never was so small a space covered with so many corpses. Everywhere the snow was stained with blood. The snow which had fallen and which was still falling began to hide the bodies from the grieving glances of passers-by. The bodies were heaped up wherever there were small groups of firs behind which the Russians had fought. Thousands of guns, helmets and breastplates were scattered on the road or in the fields. On the slope of a hill, which the enemy had obviously chosen to protect themselves, there were groups of 100 bloody bodies. Horses, maimed but still alive, waited to fall in their turn from hunger on the heaps of bodies. We had hardly crossed one battlefield when we found another, all of them strewn with bodies. Appalled at the casualties, depressed by the mounds of dead and the huge task involved in burying them, and generally suffering from nervous exhaustion, Napoleon suspended military operations and took his depleted army back into winter quarters on the 23rd of February. The Russians moved cautiously forward and retook the field of Eylau with its grisly heaps of frozen corpses. The most serious problem the emperor faced was plummeting morale in the Grand Army. The general atmosphere of chaos was compounded by a marauding army, a consequently hostile Polish peasantry, and the implosion of the physical terrain, as a sudden thaw turned frozen rivers into oceanic surges and covered everywhere with a viscous, oozy mud. Worst of all, he had somehow to repair the damage to his personal prestige, and to silence the "I told you so" voices of the Talleyrand's, who had warned of the hidden dangers of expansion into Germany. Jena was a great victory, but it did not knock out the Prussians, and Eylau seemed to be the end of the road. It was an object lesson against doubling one's stake. Napoleon, the military leader, scarcely emerges with credit from the Eylau campaign, and the myth of his invincibility was plain to see. To an extent, the near disaster of the campaign was a testament to the breakdown of the French military machine. From top to bottom it had been inadequate, with marshals disobeying orders and rankers marauding, looting, indisciplined or deserting. Yet Napoleon could not put all the blame on the shortcomings of his collaborators and underlings. He broke his own rule that corps must always be within 1 to 2 days' march of each other, and he was much too slow to order up Ney's army, which should have received its instructions on the evening of the 7th, not the morning of the 8th. Beyond that, Napoleon blundered into a battle he had not expected and nearly brought disaster on his own head by being short of soldiers on the morning of the 8th. Once again he scrambled out of the jaws of defeat by a lucky gamble with Murat's charge. Had that failed, his center would surely have buckled. The truth is that at Eylau Napoleon was saved more by his opponent's errors than his own skill. Bennigsen's cardinal error was to hesitate when Soult was repulsed instead of pressing on. When Davout appeared, he called off the attack against Soult but made poor use of his own right. Also, a determined attack against an exhausted French army at around 4 p.m., 3 hours before Ney arrived, would surely have brought victory. Until Eylau, Napoleon had rarely put a foot wrong on a battlefield. After it, with some rare and brilliant exceptions, his touch was much less sure. It was a worried man who returned to the arms of Marie Waleska. Napoleon moved his headquarters to the sumptuous Schloss Finkenstein in East Prussia, where Marie joined him for the resumption of an idyll cut short by the Eylau campaign. She was deeply in love with him, though aware that his attention span for women was not great, and therefore fearful that the affair would not last long. He certainly appreciated her more than any of his other mistresses. She seemed to have all Josephine's virtues plus special ones of her own. Where Josephine was silly, trivial and spendthrift, Marie was serious, bookish and frugal. She dismayed her lover by consistently turning down his offers of lavish presents. Her effect on him was certainly beneficial. During the sojourn at the castle of Finkenstein he displayed miraculous energy, giving detailed attention to all aspects of his empire. It can hardly be a coincidence that the new surge of vigor and confidence was evident at the height of his liaison with Marie. Among the detail Napoleon attended to was Josephine's daily life in Paris. To sustain the morale of Paris, which had been bowed down with horror stories about fields of mud into which entire divisions sank without trace in quicksands that swallowed an artillery park, Josephine held numerous state receptions for the Senate, the legislature, the diplomatic corps and even the church, while hosting lavish official dinners and gala nights. From Prussia the emperor supervised her timetable to the smallest item, even specifying the days on which she was to be at St. Cloud, and those when she was permitted to relax at Malmaison. She expressed herself depressed at her husband's long absence, and the virtual exile of her 2 children, Eugene as Viceroy of Italy and Hortense as wife to Louis, the new King of Holland. Gradually rumors about Marie Waleska reached her. She might already have suspected something from the mere fact that Napoleon had ended his ritual dirges about long, lonely winter nights. She was particularly curious about what Napoleon was getting up to at the Schloss Finkenstein, which Napoleon did not leave from the 1st of April to the 6th of June, and expressed her misgivings in a letter. The emperor's reply is vintage Bonaparte humbug. I don't know what you mean by ladies I am supposed to be involved with. I love only my little Josephine, good, sulky and capricious, who knows how to pick a quarrel with grace, as she does everything, because she is ever lovable, apart however from the times when she is jealous, when she becomes a demon. But let us return to these ladies. If I needed to busy myself with one of them, I assure you I would wish her to have pretty pink nipples. Is this the case with those of whom you speak to me? Despite provocation, Josephine did not let him down and played the role of distant imperial benefactress superbly. She did not succumb to the temptation of returning to the fleshpots of the Directory or taking up with her raffish Thermidorian friends of yore. Napoleon, though, underrated her and gave many explicit warnings about that old hedonistic crew. There was a particularly splenetic outburst on the subject of their Italian, now Princess de Chimay, who had already notched up 10 children by 4 fathers, which seemed to Napoleon to reduce her to the level of a beast in the field. He wrote to Josephine, "You are not to see her. Some wretch has married her with her litter of 8 bastards. I find her more despicable than ever. She was a nice enough trollop. She has become a horrible, infamous woman." It is impossible here not to detect some displaced envy for Tallien's fecundity, with its obvious contrast to Josephine's barrenness. The emperor's correspondence from Finkenstein shows him indisposed to suffer gladly those he took to be fools. After some nagging from Fouch about the necessity of peace, he hit back irritably, "Talking incessantly about peace is not a good means of getting it." When Hortense sent him grief-stricken letters about the death from croup of her son Charles Napoleon Louis, he reproached her sharply for her excessive lamentations. This was tantamount to letting death win. He chided, but as a soldier he knew very well that death was not that terrible an adversary. When Hortense unsurprisingly did not reply to this cold, unsympathetic condolence, Napoleon wrote in the tones of a stern but benevolent paterfamilias, "My daughter, you have not written a word, you've forgotten everything. I'm told you love no one any more and are indifferent to everything. I can see this from your silence. This is not well done, Hortense. If I had been at Malmaison, I would have shared your pain." By early June R807 Napoleon was ready to begin operations against the Russians. Herculean efforts saw the total strength of the Grand Army, including units in Naples and Dalmatia and those guarding the coasts of France and Holland, raised to 600,000 by May. 6 fresh divisions had been raised, 2 each from Italy, Germany and Poland. A particular feature of early R807 was the appearance of an army of Germany, R00000 strong, recruited particularly from Saxony and Baden, designed to make sure that Germany did not rise in his rear or Austria suddenly enter the war. The army of Germany straddled Prussia, with Jerome in command of the right wing in Silesia, Brune in the center and Mortier commanding the left in Pomerania. To make sure that there was a firm hand on Warsaw, the emperor summoned Messina from Italy. By June, Napoleon had 220,000 men in Poland and outnumbered the Russians 2-1. The two heroes of Eylau, Devout and Murat, were with him, and Lefebvre, helped by Lannes and Oudinot, had just successfully completed a second siege of Danzig. The brimming magazines of Danzig eased the French supply problem, which had been acute in the winter of Raid 06-07, and encouraged Napoleon to cast envious eyes on the next such military cornucopia, at Königsberg. The only cloud over the Grand Army was the dissolution of Augereau's 7 Corps, no longer viable after Eylau. The survivors were redistributed among the other corps. Napoleon felt confident that he could now cut Bennigsen off from his base at Königsberg, where the Russians kept their main stores and arms dumps. But the emperor's first efforts seemed to presage another Eylau. He engaged the Russians at Heilsberg on Roe June, but an indecisive, slugging battle resulted, lasting well into the darkness of a midsummer evening. By his inexplicable frontal assaults on well-defended positions, Napoleon simply produced the consequence that the French lost row 0 men without gaining any significant advantage. Finally, Napoleon did what he should have done that morning instead of offering battle, and maneuvered to threaten the Russian communications, forcing Bennigsen to withdraw from his strong defensive position on a hillside. As at Eylau, Napoleon was left in possession of the battlefield, and, also as at Eylau, he presented Heilsberg as a victory in his official bulletin. Trying to read Russian intentions, Napoleon guessed that Bennigsen would cross the Aisle on the left bank farther downriver at Friedland, but Bennigsen's plans were more ambitious. Learning that Lannes's corps was marching in detachments on Friedland, and was dangerously isolated from the rest of the French army, he gave orders to construct pontoon bridges so that his army could cross and wipe out Lannes. Unhappily for him, by the time he got the first R0000 of his men to the far side of the river, Lannes had already received reinforcements, notably a large body of cavalry under Grouchy. Bennigsen opened the battle just before dawn on the 14th of June with a huge artillery barrage, but inexplicably did not press his great local superiority. By 9 a.m. the French still only had 9,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, and there was a 45,000-strong Russian army on the other side of the river. Napoleon sent Lannes orders to lure this army over the river and pin it while the rest of the Grand Army moved up. While Bennigsen dithered, more and more reinforcements reached Lannes. At 9:30 Berthier arrived to swell Lannes's numbers to 35,000, and half an hour later there was further stiffening from another 5,000 French troops. Unaccountably, Bennigsen still made no move. Soon after midday, Napoleon arrived on the spot and assumed command. The consensus of his staff was that the best plan would be to wait until next day, for by then the heroes of Eylau, Murat and Devout, would be present and the French would have an overwhelming superiority in numbers. The emperor demurred. Two factors weighed with him. Ever superstitious, and recalling how Austerlitz on the 2nd of December had mirrored his coronation day a year before, he decided that the 14th of June, the date of Marengo, was a lucky date and he should give battle. More practically, he saw at once that Bennigsen had made an egregious mistake by deploying the Russians with their backs to the river. Furthermore, the Russian line was bisected by a millstream and a lake, which would make it very difficult for the Russian wings to support each other. By 4 p.m., with 80,000 men in position, Napoleon was convinced he had a glorious opportunity which would not present itself again. His strategy was simplicity itself. He would attack the Russians in the right angle formed by the river Alle, where the millstream bisected the two wings. This would be done swiftly, immediately, and without further artillery bombardment. Once at least 2 of the bridges over the Alle were destroyed, the remaining Russians could be driven north into the arms of Devout and Murat. At 5 p.m. he ordered Ney's corps to lead the onslaught. It was not a moment too soon. Napoleon's famous intuition had been right again. There would not have been such a unique opportunity on the morrow. By now Bennigsen had seen the danger and was just in the process of ordering a retreat when Ney attacked. He had to countermand his orders rapidly to deal with the sudden French Makersten. Bennigsen began by launching a cavalry counterattack, which was beaten off in heavy fighting. Gambling that the French could not sustain another massive cavalry attack, he ordered his elite horsemen and again, but this time they were taken in the flank by Victor's corps. Chaos ensued when the retreating Russian cavalry collided with their own infantry. The twisting confusion of cursing and panicky men gave the French gunners an unmissable target. Victor, as much the hero of Friedland as Devout had been at Auerstadt, saw his opportunity and moved up 30 cannon, opening up successively from ranges of 600 yards, 300 yards and RSO yards. French artillerymen tore gaping holes in the Russian ranks. At point-blank range, case shot did terrible damage, and hundreds of Russians fell dead within minutes. Bennigsen tried to relieve the shambles on his left by sending his reserve under Gortchakov against the key corps of Lannes, Mortier and Grouchy. The Russians would have been at their most effective south of the Millstream, but superb work by the French cavalry kept them pinned to the north of it. In desperation, Bennigsen ordered a massed bayonet charge on Ney's right flank, but this move too came to grief and thousands of Russians drowned in the Ile without getting to grips with the French. General Dupont then crossed to the north bank of the Millstream and attacked the flank and rear of the exhausted Russian center. With Ney already in the outskirts of Friedland, Bennigsen played his only remaining card and sent in the Russian Imperial Guard. These in turn were rapidly eaten up by Ney's and Dupont's men. By 8:30 p.m. Napoleon was in possession of Friedland. The Russian tactic of gutting the town literally misfired when the flames spread to the pontoon bridges and cut off further large numbers of Russian troops. Seeing that north of the Millstream a series of desperate Russian attacks had been beaten off by Oudinot's and Verdier's corps, Bennigsen had to extricate his men fast or face total disaster. With 3 out of the 4 bridges destroyed, it was touch and go for a while, but at last the Russians found a usable ford. This was the time when Napoleon, to achieve total victory, needed to unleash the 40 cavalry squadrons on his extreme left. The ill-starred Grouchy, alas, was no Murat and muffed his chance. Nonetheless, nightfall did not slacken the French pursuit, which continued until well past 1 p.m. For 8,000 casualties, Napoleon gained a decisive victory, inflicted Z0000 casualties on the Russians and took 80 guns. It had been a grim 6-month slog, but at last the French emperor had the result he wanted. This was one of his great battlefield achievements, second only to Austerlitz, and there was some justification for the words he wrote to Josephine. "My love, I can only write you a word because I am really tired. My children have worthily celebrated the Battle of Marengo. The Battle of Friedland will be just as famous and just as glorious to my people. It is a worthy sister of Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena." On the other hand, Napoleon in this battle was not an initiator, he simply reacted to Bennigsen's moves. Bennigsen made many bad mistakes on the 14th of June 1807, of which 2 stand out. He should not have allowed the 2 sectors of his army to be bisected by an unbridged stream, and he should have worked out that in the event of a Russian retreat there would probably be only one bridge left over the Ile. Friedland was in many ways the apotheosis of the Grand Army. For once the Marshalate had come up to Napoleon's expectations. General Victor won his baton as the 19th Marshal after his brilliant showing. Ney had his finest hour in the battle. Oudinot, the most obviously rising star in the Bonapartist entourage, received an annual pension of 33,000 francs for his performance and was marked down by the emperor as one to note. Yet for more thoughtful military observers there were some worrying omens, and not just the fact that the emperor, a notoriously bad horseman, had fallen from his horse no fewer than 3 times during the Friedland campaign. Napoleon, it was clear, habitually placed too much emphasis on the offensive. Clausewitz, the great Prussian military theorist who fought in this campaign, would later warn that offensives were always weakened by the very fact of advancing. In 1807, Napoleon had the numerical superiority to make his strategy work, but what would happen if ever he had to fight a campaign where he was outnumbered? This was an especially potent consideration, given that the emperor evinced more and more impatience with the chess-playing aspect of his military craft. His ignorance of terrain and failure to scout ahead adequately put him in a false position at Eylau, and his disregard of climatic and geographical factors led him to cross the Oder without taking into account the ice, snow and mud, remembering similar debacles in Egypt and Santo Domingo which arose through a fundamental ignorance of climate and geography. The emperor's more circumspect followers wondered how long it would be before he led them into a major disaster. Yet for the moment Napoleon seemed invincible, not just in practice but in principle. Tsar Alexander I, whose wildly fluctuating moods oscillated between elation and depression, decided after Friedland that negotiation was the only way forward. His peace feelers were received with secret relief by Napoleon, who was anxious to end the war before an increasingly fractious Austria was tempted to join in. The emperor had hoped Turkey would be a trump card, but a revolution on the 27th of May in Constantinople overthrew Selim III, and Napoleon was also aware that he had been away from Paris for far too long. Josephine was very good at showing the imperial eagle, but who would deal with the plots and conspiracies of the Pouches and the Talleyrand's? A truce between the French and Russians was soon agreed, and it was decided that the 2 emperors would meet on a raft in the middle of the river Niemen near the town of Tilsit. The genesis of this famous meeting is interesting. The Niemen marked the western frontier of Russia, and, since Alexander would not set foot on French-held territory nor Napoleon in Russia, an ingenious compromise was worked out. Napoleon ordered a huge barge-like raft to be built, on which was constructed an elegantly decorated apartment with a door on either side giving onto an antechamber. The two outer doors were crested with the respective national eagles. The two sovereigns then appeared at the same time on opposite banks of the river around noon on the 25th of June and got into their boats. Napoleon, with a crew of expert oarsmen, easily beat Alexander to the raft, boarded alone, walked through the apartment to the far antechamber and opened the door, waiting patiently while the Tsar's less skillful oarsmen laboriously rowed him to the rendezvous. Shortly after noon, 1.5 hours of friendly discussion began. The two men got off on the right foot when Alexander allegedly greeted Napoleon with the words, "Sire, I hate the English as much as you do." "In that case," replied Napoleon, "peace is established." The initial ease between the 38-year-old emperor and the 30-year-old Tsar had deepened into something like friendship by the end of the interview. Quite apart from other considerations, each man was physically drawn to the other. Alexander fell under the spell of a charismatic Napoleon, exerting himself to exude all his well-known charm. Napoleon, as he later acknowledged, was much affected by the physical beauty of the Tsar and described him as an Apollo. Alexander was tall and handsome, with blue eyes and blonde curls. Both men later went on record that they loved each other. Napoleon also thought Alexander highly intelligent, but some nagging internal voice gave him pause. As he said later, "There is something missing. I have never been able to discover what it is. A decadent Byzantine, a Talma of the North." By referring to his favorite actor, Napoleon was actually revealing more about himself than the Tsar. Alexander's problem was not histrionic but psychological. Debate has raged about his exact mental state. Some have thought him schizophrenic while others opt for depressive mania. His frequent mood swings have even led some to posit the multiple personality model of dementia praecox. At the very least, Alexander was disturbingly neurotic. He liked to think of himself as a simple soldier, but this was bunk. He was actually a physical coward who had stayed well clear of the fighting in the Austerlitz campaign, and would do so again during the stirring days of Rate RZ. Next day, the 26th of June, the two sovereigns met at 12:30 and spent the day together until 9 p.m. Thereafter, the protocol-conscious courtiers on either side devised an elaborately egalitarian program. On the 27th, Napoleon visited the Tsar for a review and dinner, and next day the emperor played host to Alexander. This was the day Napoleon chose for his elaborate Ottoman charade. An obvious barrier to an accord between France and Russia was Napoleon's incitement of Turkey. The opportune removal of Selim III and the coup of Z8 May gave Napoleon the excuse he needed. He could now pretend that his entente with Selim had been purely personal, and that it lapsed with a change of sultan. Although he already knew the news from Constantinople, as did Alexander, Napoleon pretended that his intelligence service was lackadaisical, and had only just got word of the coup. As he sat with the Tsar around 4 in the afternoon of Z8 June, a courier arrived with an urgent dispatch. Napoleon opened it, read it and jumped up with feigned astonishment. To Alexander he said excitedly that he no longer had debts of honor to Turkey as Selim had been deposed. "This is an act of providence. It tells me that the Ottoman Empire can no longer exist." By all accounts Alexander swallowed this and hung on every word. While the diplomats got down to the small print of the draft treaty, the tiring and stressful round of dinners and meetings between the two rulers went on daily until the 5th of July. Then Queen Louise of Prussia arrived. Using all her charm and cajolery, she made strenuous efforts to get the draconian terms of the draft peace treaty amended, but Napoleon could not forgive her for her obduracy after Jena, that had cost him so much blood and treasure. To Josephine he wrote, "The Queen of Prussia is really charming. She is full of coquetry for me. But don't be jealous. It's water off a duck's back to me. It's too much effort for me to play the gallant." Finally, the Tilsit Agreement was ready for signature on the 7th of July. It was ratified 2 days later so that, at last, on the 9th of July, Napoleon bade farewell to the intriguing and enigmatic Alexander. A quite separate treaty with Prussia was signed on the 9th of July and ratified on the RZTH. The Treaty of Tilsit gave the Tsar a free hand against European Turkey and Finland. Russia would join Napoleon's blockade of Britain. The Russian Navy would help France capture Gibraltar. In a secret protocol, the Tsar promised to raise no objections to Napoleonic interventions in Spain and Portugal, though this did not justify, as was later alleged, Bonapartist assertions that Alexander had formally connived at the expulsion of the Bourbons in the Iberian Peninsula and their replacement by Napoleon's brothers. Alexander also agreed informally, this did not form part of the final protocol, that he would collaborate in a joint Franco-Russian project aimed at British power in India, initially by sending an S-0000 strong army into Persia. Napoleon's extreme duplicity here must be stressed, for before Friedland he had been encouraging the Persians to ally themselves with him and thus regain from Russia the lost province of Georgia. Napoleon was to mediate in the Russo-Turkish conflict, and, if the new sultan refused his mediation, the Ottoman provinces in Eastern Europe were to be shared between the signatories. In return, Alexander was to mediate in the Franco-British War. If Britain refused, Alexander would bring pressure on the courts of Copenhagen, Stockholm and Lisbon to force them to close their ports to English produce. The treaty with Prussia represented a humiliation for the Hohenzollerns. Prussia was restricted to her 1772 frontiers, and the French held on to the fortress of Magdeburg. All Prussian possessions west of the Elbe and a part of Hanover were incorporated in the new Kingdom of Westphalia, with Napoleon's brother Jerome as king. All Prussian provinces in Poland were to be merged in a Grand Duchy of Warsaw, to be ruled by the King of Saxony. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw and the Kingdom of Westphalia in turn would form part of the Confederation of the Rhine, which became a colossus that swallowed up all Germany except Prussia and Austria. Danzig would be a free city but occupied by a French garrison. There would be a huge war indemnity, and French troops would remain on Prussian soil until it was paid. Finally, Prussia agreed to join the continental system, and to recognize the kingdoms of Westphalia, Holland, Naples and the Confederation of the Rhine. The Treaty of Tilsit brought Napoleon close to total triumph in Europe. It was a particular blow to Britain because the Baltic was the primary source of supplies for the Royal Navy. The best timber for masts came from Russia. The best furs for ships' decks came from Russia. 90% of Britain's hemp came from Russia, and the best underwater planking was provided by Baltic oak. Russia also supplied most of Britain's tallow, half her linseed, half her pitch, tar and iron. The rest came from Sweden, which was now firmly in the Russian sphere of influence. It was not surprising that in 1807-08 the British were preoccupied with the Baltic, and entertained particular fears about the Russian and Danish navies. The Royal Navy maintained a large fleet there in the ice-free summer months, and after 1808 had 20 battleships and 38 frigates on permanent station. Even though the Royal Navy gained a striking success in 1807 with the capture of the 69-strong Danish navy, that year also saw Britain blundering to disaster in Buenos Aires, Egypt and the Dardanelles. Not surprisingly, after Tilsit both George III and Canning were in favor of an accommodation with Napoleon. For a long time he dithered, then turned down the offer in 1808 just before he launched into his Spanish adventure. Tilsit also completed the alienation of Talleyrand from the emperor. Two opinions are possible on this. On the one hand, the treacherous and venal Talleyrand was now in the pay of Austria, and actively involved in subverting Napoleon's designs. He surreptitiously urged Alexander to resist Napoleon for the good of all Europe and advised him that the notables in France were happy with the natural frontiers, and wanted no part of the emperor's German adventurism. On the other, Talleyrand had long argued that even the natural frontiers were an insuperable barrier to peace and that only a return to the 1792 frontiers would guarantee stability in Europe. In any case, he argued, weakening Austria and Prussia was wrong-headed as it meant destroying Europe's natural bulwark against Russia, and it was obvious that Alexander was merely playing for time. After Tilsit, Napoleon turned his face homewards and began a leisurely progress back to Paris. In Dresden on the 19th of July the Polish deputies for the new Duchy of Warsaw were presented to him, and he dictated to them the constitution of the new government. While in Dresden he found time for a brief affair with Charlotte von Komanzig. A week later he was back at St. Cloud, where Fouch and Talleyrand found him much changed. Talleyrand recorded that even his voice seemed different after Tilsit. Certainly the harsher side of his nature came to the fore, and after July 1, 1807 his reflex action when faced with a problem was to use a heavy hand, be it military force, secret police or government censorship. Fouch reported that Parisians were becoming increasingly restless with his regime, the recent military and diplomatic successes notwithstanding. They sensed that the war with the Russians had been a near-run thing and dreaded the social and economic consequences if French society was to remain on a permanent wartime footing. Fouch indeed now concluded that the emperor was incapable of dealing rationally with bad news. It was the generally received opinion in France, certainly with hindsight, that at Tilsit the emperor crossed an invisible Rubicon. He thought himself poised on the cusp of permanent European hegemony, but was about to start sliding down a slippery slope whose end would be disaster.